Hello, everybody. Welcome to Know Your Money. I'm Bronwyn Weiner.
And I'm Craig Finch, and we are from Growth Financial Planning. We hope you enjoy our podcast. Hello, viewers. Today we have Jakes back in the studio, and we're going to be speaking about not having a will. Jakes, will you just introduce yourself again to our viewers?
Hello viewers, I'm Jakes Myberg from Wax Attorneys. We are a law firm based in Randburg, Greenside, and just thank you for having us today to discuss the problems one can have of not having a will.
Yeah, fabulous. I think if you can maybe just say what exactly would happen next, what do they need to be mindful of?
Great, yes. So we deal with three acts in our profession, and the acts deal with when a person, in this case, does not have a will. So you will have your Interstate Succession Act, you will have your Administration of Deceased Act, which is your L&D account, which we mentioned in the previous podcast, is your liabilities and distribution account. And then we have the Estate Duty Act. Well, the Estate Duty Act, we can maybe touch on.
What is that? Yeah.
The Estate Duty Act is what you will then have to pay. It's like a type of tax.
So duty just means tax?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Might or might not. Normally, if you have a small estate, you might get off that you're not going to pay. Everyone gets 3.5 million. So from that, it gets deducted. So
yeah. So 3.5 million is free of estate duty.
It's free of estate duty, yes.
So if you have an estate of 10 million rand, how does the duty get worked out?
So should we do the passing away without a will, and we can do like a tax one?
Yes, I think we will discuss tax later.
No problem.
So last episode we said you have a will, it's signed, it's witnessed, and it's kept in a safe place.
Yes, yeah.
This episode is I don't have a will. Yes. Pass away, and I've got, what happens then? Do you help the clients, Jakes, or not?
Yes, life happened and you wanted to maybe make a will and it just passed and you just never gotten to make a will. So when a person dies interstate, there's a lot of complications that arises, because now the problem is that the law decides how your estate will be administered.
So how it's divided, basically.
How it will be divided between who is still around.
And is that via the master again?
Yes, everything goes through the master.
Okay.
And that's where you then need to look at the Interstate Succession Act to determine who is going to basically inherit and who's not. So in the previous podcast, we spoke about you have legatees and you have residuary heirs. Here we only deal with heirs. So everyone is going to inherit. But it depends on if you have a spouse or if there's no spouses, whether there's children involved or not.
Does it depend on how you married? So like if you married in community of property, does the spouse get everything? Or if there's kids, does that change?
So the way that you are married are always important. So if you are married in community of property, you need to remember that your spouse always gets half of the estate. So half of the estate is his or hers, other half will then be whoever passed away. And the same will be with married out of community of property, with the accrual or without the accrual. Then you will need to look how you were married and how that will be devolved.
So can I give a practical example? So what you're saying there is if you married in community of property and you own a house, okay, that house is worth 2 million rand. 1 million rand is the spouse that's alive. Correct. That will be hers because it's 50-50. The other 1 million rand then gets split according to how they say it should be. So the spouse and 2 kids.
Correct. You see, so if you had a will, you could have decided, I want the house to be
left to my
wife or children. That will be another topic for another day. But since you do not have a will, it just becomes more complicated, because now you have to decide whether you're going to sell the property because the children would maybe want their share. They can always say, listen,
So
I
can you
don't want
explain that house? If it was 2 million and now that million, how would it be divided
So
between
the
a
2
spouse
million-
and 2 children?
The 2 million will then be divided between the 1 million between a married in community of property between the 2 spouses. So the wife will get her million, the 2 million, the remainder of the 2 million, which is the 1 million, will then be split between, let's say there's a wife and 2 children. So the law states that there's a child's portion that needs to be paid out. And currently the minimum is 250,000 Rand as decided by the minister. And that will then, the 250,000 Rand, so you will have to then do a bit of a calculation, divide between the spouse and 2 children plus 1, so that will be 250,000 because you will then deal with 4 people, where there's just 3 people, but you always do add just 1 person.
Why do you add 1 person?
That's just in terms of the law. So the 250, there will be then 250,000 Rand to be, that's the child's portion calculation. Just that.
Okay, so each child gets 250K, so that leaves 500,000 left. What happens to that?
So the 250,000 Rand per child's portion, that's what the child get, and the other 500,000 then gets given to the wife.
Now, what happens if the children are 4 years old or 3 years old?
That will then, that money will then be paid over to the Guardians Fund until they reach an age of majority, which is 18 years, and then they can go and get
So,
their
Jakes, the
money.
Guardians Fund receives that money because there's no will.
Correct.
If there was a will, you could have left that money in a trust for those children until they, whatever, 25.
In the will, you could have decided how that money needs to be distributed.
So the Guardians Fund comes into play with no will.
Correct.
And
So that's when the state comes and it needs to be paid.
who's funding the Guardians' will?
What is the Guardians Fund?
The Guardians Fund is a fund created by the government.
Yeah.
And the government, that's where money gets paid over, where there's no one that comes forward to claim the money, and money that pays over to minor children. So that's just a fund that keeps all the money safe.
Okay, but
So Warren, I think
how
it's
are the operating costs of that fund funded? How
well,
is
they
that
charge a
through the
fee.
duty or is it through a fee?
No, they charge a fee. So the Guardians Fund is a central fund that the government controls,
Okay.
but they're not taking your money. They're
No,
not
no,
gonna-
but they're charging
that's
you.
They
the
keep it safe.
feeling. The feeling is that the Guardians Fund, they're taking my money.
Okay.
The problem with the Guardians Fund is there's little control over the money because the government controls it, and there's an administration probably backlog on that scenario. But they hold the money from behalf of the minor children until they become majors, and they pay it out.
Okay.
Also, they hold money in case there's, let's say Jakes was just telling me, there's a portion where you don't have a wife, you don't have kids, you don't have an aunt and uncle, there's just you in the world on your own. You don't know of any other relative, and you pass away without a valid will. Your assets will go into the Guardians Fund,
Okay.
and it'll stay there for 30 years.
But is that fund growing over that
Yeah,
30
yeah,
years?
that-
Is your share of it growing?
Yes,
It is.
I think it's invested. I'm not sure the technicality of the investment of
Yeah.
that, but it is growing.
Because ultimately, if it's 250 grand in today's money versus
no.
30 years money, that's nothing.
No, sure,
Yeah.
it will grow. It will be so. It's for the benefit of minor children or heirs that you don't know there are,
Yeah.
to make sure that the correct people inherit your estate.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I
So
understand,
you
yeah.
all of us want to have that stormy night, the lightning's hitting your house, and there's a knock on the door, and you open, and there's a messenger saying, "Oh, are you Warren Grimsby? Your uncle, lost uncle in the Karoo has left you a farm," and you hear the
So
title deeds.
What's after the 30 years? What happens?
Then
That
it remains in
falls
the fund.
to the state.
To the state.
Okay.
So if you don't come forward within that 30 years and you feel like you might have been the beneficiary to this interstate estate, then the state will take that.
Okay.
And now, if it is in the Guardians Fund and the child actually needs that money, what happens? Can you ask the Guardians Fund
Yes.
and then?
Yeah, so they will, it'll be administered by the government to make sure that the lawful child who's
Their
underage,
school fees are paid for
there
from
is,
that money.
administration. Yeah, but the problem is it's probably inefficiently administered just because the volumes are there. That's why even more reason to have a will. Because what about minor children? You want that trust to be controlled by a proper administrator, not by a central fund. So that's very, very important.
No, I mean, government generally, the inefficiency is associated with
Yeah,
government and the high
correct.
volume that they'll be dealing
Yeah,
with.
but they're not taking your money. They're making
No, I
sure.
understand, but
So
it's
the
actually
same
a lot
as
harder to get it
Yeah.
than if it was independently managed by somebody
correct.
else. Yes.
That's why the master's there to make sure that the correct people receive it, and the guardians fund is the minor children or heirs that we don't know about are the correct heirs that receive it. But it's inefficient.
And so if you said up to 3.5 million is your free allowance
Correct.
if you don't have a will.
That's
it just
if you have a will or if you don't
okay,
have a will. That
so
doesn't matter.
when we go over that 3.5 million, what happens?
Then you will start paying estate duty.
And is the
tax.
estate duty a flat duty, or does it escalate much like tax does as to how much it is? Your income, for example. So if the higher income you are, the higher tax you pay as a percentage.
It's a flat 20% up to a point they I think it's 10 million now. Then it reduces. So it depends on the value of your estate. But if you're married, then your spouse, your wife, your husband, or your spouse, same-sex spouse, receives your estate without any.
So that's why often people leave everything to their spouse, because that estate duty is delayed until the next person passes away. So
remember, each one gets 3.5 million.
Yeah.
So whatever, let's say you go over 3.5 million, and it's now 4.5 million, and the previous spouse died, but that was 3.5 million and was never touched. So that goes over to the next spouse. So that spouse will still not be liable because now there's the 7 million.
So you roll it over. So if a husband passes away, the 3.5 is in play, and when the wife passes away, she transfers
Is this an
that.
argument for polygamy?
So I think between husband and wife or between spouses,
Yeah,
there's no estate duty.
understood.
And then the last dying, there is a 7 million rand free of estate duty.
Understood.
Why is that? It's because the government, the state wants to promote marriage. So a married society is a more stable society. Therefore, there's no tax between spouses. So you can donate anything to your spouse, and there's no estate duty.
Okay, and so actually, if you are married, it's only over that 7 million effectively that you start.
If the last person passes away.
Then the children, whatever's left, then they will start paying. But that original 7 million that was accrued between the spouses is not really touchable after both spouses have died.
No.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think taxes are different, completely different discussion, and that's what does come into play with when Bronwyn and I do financial planning on estates. That's a part of a big part of it. To how do you fund it, and then of course Jakes would handle the estate and the practicalities of the L&D account or not having a will. So what he's saying now is that if you don't have a will, am I right, Jakes? And there's husband, wife, and kids. The kids will inherit as well.
The kids will inherit, yes.
do you have a practical example of how it happened? And
So the practical example I have is more in terms of where there's not enough in the estate. So I've got a recent client who came to us and she said there are 3 daughters, father has died, interstate, the mother's still alive. So in terms of the law, then the mother and the 3 children will inherit, but they decide, there's a small property available. They can just basically say we don't want to inherit, so they will then just sign affidavits, and the mother will inherit all the money. But otherwise, there would have just been problems. But persons need to understand that it's not a given right to inherit. It's just a privilege. So if there's nothing to inherit, then that's just what it is.
Can if your liabilities outweigh your assets, how does that work? If you die without without a will?
So there is not enough assets to cover your estate. Then you will turn to the creditors and you will say, "This is all that's available." So you will pay where you can, and you will die without liquidity. So you'll basically be insolvent, and
Right, but then
no one will inherit.
there's no ability for the creditors to then go and go for the next of kin for
No,
amount owed.
if you die, that's not for the children. So you can't be liable for someone else's.
Okay, and what about a spouse?
That depends on how you were married.
How you married?
So
Okay.
community of property is a problem.
Mm.
So the L&D account still gets, you still prepare an L&D account the same way as you would do a normal L&D for
You
a...
would, yes.
Okay, so then what will happen there, Warren, is that a creditor will not get anything. So that's an
You will
insolvent
just
estate.
say there isn't enough in the estate.
And they
to
would
cover
still
all.
close the state. They still close the state with a master, and it's just how it is.
And then back to that in community of property. So if your husband owes all of this money and then he was insolvent, you then become insolvent and you have to pay all of that debt back.
Yeah, so that's a bad thing to happen.
Yes. And so in community of property can be a bit dangerous.
And community of property is the law of the land. So if you don't have a prenup or a contract, then you are community of property. And the other side of it, Jakes will say that as well, that you charge the 3.5% plus VAT on the full estate.
Not on, well, yes.
So if
Community
we
of
married
property.
in community of property and the one spouse passes away, the whole estate, the executor has to finalise, not just your half, is what Craig's asking.
You only look at the deceased, so not on the entire regime. The 3.5% will be paid on what's in a certain estate. So there's 2 million, and half is the wife's and half is the deceased, but the liabilities are way over, let's say, 4 million. Then there's 2 million rand that needs to be recovered, and that's not going to be possible. So they will sell the properties, recover the 2 million, but only 3.5% of that certain estate that you have been dealt with. That's what the executor will take, but not on both estates, because the other person is still alive. So that will only come later.
Okay. Is there anything else on
On
dying without a
interstate.
will that you want to just maybe say towards the end?
So it's just important to always remember, if you die without a will, you are going to open up a whole can of worms, and you don't want to do that to your beneficiaries or whoever is left behind,
Your loved ones.
your loved ones, or it could be just a nearest relative. So if you don't have any ascendants, that's children or a spouse, and you've got descendants, which is your grandparents or mother and father, you want to still be able to want to take care of them, maybe, because circumstances could have been different for each and every person, but you want to ensure that your will gets executed the way that you want it. So if you don't have that, no, then you've got no control. The person who's left behind has no control over how it's going to be distributed. So the importance is really to have a will, as opposed to letting it slide and think, well, tomorrow could be another day and I'll sort that out.
Could I ask one last question about wills? So you obviously have people like you use Capital Legacy, I believe.
And Vardelis Fox.
Yes, so you have institutions that specialize in this, but then you also have, banks and other institutions that offer this as
free
a
service.
service. What would you say to people who get that offer?
I have a personal experience with banks. I can't speak on all of them because I don't know what their processes are. But
But your experience, yeah.
my experience is that the after my dad passed on. So he's had a will from 1990. He's never amended it. No one's told him to make changes. So that is the will. And after we located the will, they said, listen, you have to pay 10,000 Rand before we will even touch anything. So
Sure.
we had to go and report the estate to the master and try and sort out the 10,000 Rand that they wanted us to pay. And that's just a deposit to start the will.
Sure.
Then they come and they were appointed as the executors. So you would think as a beneficiary that all will be sorted. No. They come and they say, okay, well, we want the 10,000 Rand to be paid over. Then all sorts of other administration that they want you to pay over. So in
So you're
my
held
case,
captive, effectively, financially captive until you pay the money.
yeah, so you can't do anything until they say, listen, pay us the money. Or you have to bind yourself to say, right, I'll pay the 80,000 Rand. So you paid the 10,000 Rand, then you still owe 70,000 Rand. You have to go to your brothers, your sisters, mother, whoever you feel like, where you can go and say, listen, we need this money. Then you have to bind one person, not everyone. Only one person binds themselves to saying, I'm going to ensure that the remaining 70,000 Rand is paid over. So you bind yourself to 10,000 Rand that need to be paid. And if you don't pay that, then they will just walk away from the estate.
And you can't go to the master and change the executor.
No, until they decide, in my case that has happened, they decide, you know what, we will resign because they saw there was just a lot of issues and the beneficiaries weren't happy with them, because you must remember, banks and other institutions, they deal with a lot of these types of matters. So they say they've got like 1,000 matters that they're dealing with. So your matter is probably not the top on their list. So if you pass on and you get and they get your file, they will see, okay, well, let's see who's more important. So in that time, the liabilities could accrue. They take time to close the bank account. They will decide, we will sell your property for probably less than what it's worth, because they will sell it on auction. So
No.
basically you're far worse than where you were. Let's say you appointed a family member to oversee that, but more important, someone that deals with these matters on a daily basis, and they understand your predicament and they can walk the mile with you, instead of someone that just sees you as another number. And because this is 1,000 this month, next month more people will die, so it will just accrue, and they will just want to get this wrapped up as quickly as possible. And I
So
would say
inefficient.
yes.
That's the problem.
I've got further than that, but yeah.
Yeah, so what Jack said, there's too many, they might have too many to administer, there's no personal touch on it, and that's where we are involved as financial planners. If something happens, we go with the clients to for example, Capital Legacy, and we make sure that things run smoothly. I think what you also made, the point is of not having a will, it's not a desperate situation, because the master still gets involved, administration, firms like you still get involved to help the client go through the process,
Yes.
but you don't have control over the process. Well, you're not here, but I mean, your wishes aren't your wishes. It goes with what the law says.
Yes.
And it
Yeah.
may not be your wishes, and that's the problem. I think we should wrap it up on that.
Yes, on that
Yeah.
note. Thank you so
Jakes.
much for your time. Really appreciate having
Thank
you
you,
here.
guys.
Good to
It
have
was
you,
great.
Jakes. Thank
Very
you.
interesting, Jack. Thank you very
Only a
much.
pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed this podcast, would like to subscribe, please visit our website, www.growthfp.co.za. The information we have provided in this podcast is our personal opinion. For more detailed information, please discuss your financial situation with a financial planner.